AITA for leaving my husband at the hospital after he refused to be in the delivery room with me. This happened 2 months ago, but it's still causing major friction in my family. So I need some outside opinions. I, 29F, and my husband Jake, 32M, have been together for 6 years, married for 3. Date, we discussed birth plans. I was adamant that I wanted Jake in the delivery room. I needed his support, and he'd always agreed. However, a few weeks before my due date, Jake started acting strange. He was distant, distracted, and wouldn't engage in any baby-related discussions. I thought he was just anxious about becoming a dad, so I didn't press him too much. The day I went into labor, Jake drove me to the hospital but seemed off. He was quiet and kept checking his phone. When we got there, he pulled the nurse aside and spoke to her privately. She came back and told me Jake wouldn't be in the delivery room because he was uncomfortable with blood and medical procedures. I was stunned. He'd never mentioned this before. I begged him to stay, told him I needed him, but he just kept saying, "I can't do this." I was heartbroken and furious, but I didn't have much time to dwell on it as my contractions were getting stronger. Jake said he'd be in the waiting room and kissed me on the forehead before leaving. I was left alone, crying and feeling utterly abandoned. Labor was long, painful, and traumatic. I was alone the entire time except for the medical staff. When our son was finally born, I was exhausted emotionally and physically. The nurse handed me my son, and all I felt was a deep sadness that Jake wasn't there to share this moment. After I was taken to a recovery room, I asked the nurse to get Jake. She came back and said he'd left the hospital hours ago. I couldn't believe it. I called him repeatedly, but he didn't answer. Finally, I sent him a text saying I was done and he could find his own way home. I didn't see him until the next day. He showed up at the hospital with flowers and an apology, saying he'd panicked and needed some air. He claimed he'd gone home to shower and change and fell asleep, which I didn't buy for a second. He told him I didn't believe him. I was overwhelmed with anger and hurt, and I told him he had let me down in the worst possible way.
He kept apologizing, saying he knew he'd messed up and he'd do anything to make it right. I didn't
want him near me or our son at that moment, so I asked him to leave. He tried to protest, but I told him I needed time to process everything. He left, and I spent the rest of my hospital stay alone with my baby, trying to grapple with the enormity of what had happened. Since then, Jake has been trying to make amends. He's been taking parenting classes, attending therapy, and is constantly trying to be present and supportive. But I can't shake the feeling of betrayal. He abandoned me at one of the most vulnerable moments of my life. Every time I look at him, I remember being alone in that delivery room, terrified and in pain, wondering why the person who promised to be by my side wasn't there. My family is split. Some think I'm being too hard on Jake, that he made a mistake and is clearly remorseful. They say he's a good father and partner otherwise, and I should focus on moving forward for the sake of our child. Others think what he did was unforgivable and I should leave him. They believe I'll never truly trust him again, and that's no foundation for a marriage. I'm torn. I do still love him and I know he loves me and our son. But part of me wonders if I'll ever get over this. Was it just a moment of weakness on his part, or a sign of something deeper that I can't overlook?